Shortly before Christmas 1917, Captain Herbert Leland finally broke down. He was evacuated back to Britain.
You will be very sorry to see that I am in the officers' hospital. I don't know how you will take it, but personally I am very sick. The doctors insist on my having a complete rest away from the sound of guns, and I am to go home for at least a month. Don't worry, it is not my fault.
Being a proud military man, I think the effect of giving in to weakness and being taken out of the battle without being physically wounded was something that he was very ashamed of. And again, he's conscious that his wife and family might feel shame. It wasn't done.
The stigma of shell shock was such that officers were not meant to break down, but many, like Herbert Leland, did. These officers were found to be suffering from a neurosis that was born out of prolonged and exhausting exposure to war. Doctors called it neurasthenia. The use of this term helped avoid the more embarrassing diagnosis of shell shock on their medical records.
There obviously had to be an understanding of what was happening to not only the men, but the officer class as well. How could people with VCs, DSOs, how could they break down? So not just society, but more particularly perhaps the military hierarchy had to try and come to some understanding as to what was happening.
Craiglockhart Military Hospital for Officers on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Before the war, it was an asylum for the wealthy. As such, it was considered suitable for neurasthenic officers and was converted in 1916. The war poet Siegfried Sassoon was treated here in 1917. Sassoon described Craiglockhart as a large mausoleum of a place, a live museum of war neuroses.
By night, the hospital became sepulchral and oppressive with saturations of war experience. One lay awake and listened to feet padding along passages which smelt of stale cigarette smoke. One became conscious that the place was full of men whose slumbers were morbid and terrifying. Around me was that underworld of dreams haunted by submerged memories of warfare and its intolerable shocks and self-lacerating failures to achieve the impossible.
One figure above all dominated Craiglockhart, the psychologist William Rivers. Dr. Rivers believed that his patients should confront the horrors to which they had been subjected.
The basis of Rivers' approach was going back to the story, going back to the event. Not just telling the story, but the event with the emotion. That you had to have the emotion and the story to come to terms with the experience, to make peace with the experience, to accept it and move on in your life. Otherwise you would be stuck.
Rivers' central belief was that shell shock was the result of a conflict between self-preservation and the obligation to stay and fight. Soldiers became so worn down struggling between the two impulses that they became physically ill, especially after 4 long years of war. Rivers' ability to engage with these shattered young men earned their lasting respect and, in some cases, devotion. John Harry Burns was one of these men. He had been buried alive in a church during the bombardment of Arras in 1917. He had lost all but 2 of his 200 men and suffered a total mental collapse. He was sent to Craiglockhart, where he was treated by Rivers and his team. From Craiglockhart, he wrote,
"At present, my nerves are in a very poor state. The slightest noise affects my heart. I suffer very much through insomnia and also have acute pains in my head. I shall remain for a considerable time incapacitated.
Day trips and social activities were encouraged as part of the treatment. Burns' wife would often come and visit. But despite their best efforts, they could make little progress. Memories of the war continued to haunt Harry Burns.
His principal doctors felt that they just hadn't opened his mind at all. He was purposely closing it. And I think that's what was. But what he wanted to do was to find the men that he'd been lost with, that had lost with him that day, and there were about 200 of them, and to find their discs and find their bones and help in the burying of them.
Rivers suggested to Burns' wife that his only chance of recovery was to take him back to France to lay his ghosts to rest. The idea of actually revisiting the scene of past traumas grew out of Rivers' belief that men should not hide from their experiences. The end of the war in November 1918 gave Burns, and many others like him, the opportunity to make peace with themselves on the Western Front.
My mother and his sister willingly took him, and they were there for 6 months. And they met the Canadian War Graves Commission, and my father was able to stay back with the officer for some months. And they found a great number of the things he'd been fretting about, limbs and the identification discs of his men. It seemed it was his salvation. My mother always used to tell me that if it hadn't been for Craig Lockett, we might never have got Daddy back.
Rivers and his colleagues treating shell shock during the Great War changed forever the perception and treatment of the damaged mind. There was no longer a rigid distinction between the mad and the sane. Instead, there was a new understanding of temporary mental breakdown, to which anyone could fall victim.
Shell shock and the psychological reactions to the battlefields of the First War, I think for the first time allowed us to negotiate within society that external events could affect you internally, that perfectly normal, rational, brave, courageous human beings could be brought to tears, could mentally break down, lose their emotions, and actually regain control again.
Psychology then became much more popular, and people for the first time realized that psychology has a deep understanding of why people do what they do or don't do what they don't do, and that it's connected with all sorts of fears and angst and apprehension and dreams and that kind of thing. And I think for the first time, perhaps, people became interested in the mental troubles that ordinary people might have.
Some 200,000 men were shell-shocked during the war. Many were cured, but for others, the awful memories of war continued to dominate their lives. In 1921, 3 years after the war, nearly 15,000 men were still in hospital. Others, like Harry Burns, had to cope as best they could.
My father never got over the terrible trauma of the war, but he was able somehow to keep it at bay pretty well. But I always remember his horrific shouting and screaming in the night. And it was really dreadful. And my mother trying to calm him down and everything, but of course I didn't see anything unusual about it. Went on every night and that was it. I thought everybody's daddy did things like that in the night. And cowered under the bed, and howled and screamed.
The Great War had devastated the nation. and in the years that followed, people tried to put their suffering behind them. The lessons about shell shock, so hurriedly learned during the war, were quickly put aside by the military in peacetime. Its new discipline, military psychiatry, lay dormant. But only 20 years after armistice, another conflict would break out. And once more, the horrors of war would ravish the minds of fighting men.
And the way the condition was treated in the Second World War is examined next Sunday at 8 o'clock here on 4. And the book Shell Shock by Wendy Holden is available in the shops, price $14.99.